Well, y'all, it's happening. I'm actually making another story time. Making story times throughout 2022 is almost impossible to do because of my book, my overall attitude towards making story times, and college. But now that I'm finished with my book, and I'm feeling much better about making story times, and I'm now pretty much now at the halfway point in college, I feel a lot better about making story times. So expect 2023 to be a much more active year regarding story time than 2022 was. Anyways, let's get into the video. Alright, so second semester of college. This semester is usually much easier than your first semester because now you've adapted to college life as well as mastered study habits that work for you. While I would definitely say that my second semester, being fall 2022, was much easier than my first semester, being spring 2022, there were also many factors that could also back up the claim that fall to 2022 was much more difficult than spring 2022. So today, I'm going to discuss my second semester of college. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 47, on January 13th, 2023. So I guess to begin the story time, I'm going to give you all a backstory, so in case you haven't seen Storytime 43 or 46, then we're on the same pace. I'll talk a little bit about where I go to school, what I'm studying, and then I'm going to compare and contrast my first semester to this semester. Then I'll talk about the summer of 2022, as I also took some classes over the summer, and then I'll begin discussing the fall 2022 semester. So to start, where do I go to college? Well, I don't go anywhere too special. I just go to a local state school about an hour from where I live. While nowadays it's one of those that is nice but isn't too special, in the spring, this was massive. If you saw Storytime 46, you're probably familiar with the story of how my roommate was a crackhead. But this semester, since I had my own room, I really didn't need to go home as often. More about my housing assignment later. But the school I go to is really big. Like, there are over 35,000 students who go here, so a lot goes on around campus. Well, there's definitely a lot more off-campus than on-campus, as the whole area has been absolutely thriving over the past decade, but there's a lot around the area to do. Anyways, what am I studying? Well, I'm studying accounting. To be honest, I really only chose this field because my parents recommended it to me, but it was a good recommendation. I love math, and we do a lot of math in accounting. Well, whenever we don't have Excel, that is. But I've come to find that it is a very applicable field, as I could use the ratios and other important factors of a financial statement that I've learned to make better selections in which companies to buy stock in, as well as personal money management. However, at the end of this semester, I will get the chance to officially declare my major, but as we'll see, I will do something a little different. So now let's talk about some differences between my first and second semester. So probably the biggest difference was my age. So my first semester of college was very strange since not only did I come in during the spring, but I was also only 17 years old. As a result, I couldn't do things such as join clubs and other things that require you to be 18. But last June, I celebrated my 18th birthday, so that enabled me to do a lot more. But unfortunately, I would learn that things weren't as easy as I thought they would be when I recorded Storytime 46. Another difference is that I am now used to campus overall. Having been there a whole semester, I was now used to the environment and my setting overall, so I didn't struggle with finding my way to the dining halls or where buildings were. Well, I still looked for where my classes were a few days before classes began, so I knew where they were, but overall I knew where I was. I also saw a huge difference in the classes I took this semester. Last semester, I took a bunch of gen eds. This semester, I actually took some business classes, which I'll get to that later. Anyways, let's talk about the classes I took last summer. So the way my school set summer schedule is by splitting the summer into two halves. You can take up to 2 classes each half. I did my, one class, one half each. So for the first half, which was last from May to the end of June, I took Economics 2102, which is Principles of Microeconomics. This is a special class because it was my first time taking an actual university business course. Even though I took a class called Business Professional Development last spring, it was only a 1-credit course, so it really didn't count. So this was it. Overall, I had a blast taking microeconomics. My professor was absolutely awesome, and he did a great job with teaching the course, even if it was online. However, the 3rd week into the course, I would take a cruise to the Bahamas to celebrate my 18th birthday, as well as to celebrate my dad's 51st birthday, since our birthdays are 2 days apart. While I had a blast on this cruise, it did hinder my grade because I didn't attend class and stuff. But I still came out successful and made an 83 in the class, giving me a B for microeconomics. I then had a week break, not winter break, that's a little later. Once that was over, it was time to begin working on my second course, which was Accounting 2121, Principles of Accounting 1. This is my first exposure to the accounting world and what it was all about, so I was pumped for the class. And sure enough, this class did not disappoint at all. While I think there are sometimes exceptions, the phrase parents knows best is pretty applicable in this situation. I think that after taking this class, think recommending accounting was extremely good on their part, as I enjoyed it, though, enough that I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. So that's what I decided to go into. But as we'll see, it's not the only thing that I'm studying. But in this course, I finished with a 97, giving me an A for Principles Accounting 1. So now before I begin talking about moving in and how my housing assignment worked, I want to discuss getting an on-campus job. So this ended up being the second job I've ever had. I never discussed the first job, which I had during my, sorry about that, my phone kind of went off. Oh man, that's not good. Okay, I'll restart here. I've never discussed my first job, which I had during my senior semester of high school, but I'll just say that I worked as a stocker at a pretty prevalent grocery store chain in the southeast. I'll give it a story time of its own later this year, since my dad has been begging me to do a story time on it for the longest time now, so be on the lookout for it. Anyways, for my second job, I worked at my college's bookstore. Now, unlike working for the grocery store, where all I did was stock items and block shelves, I did practically everything at the bookstore. From the usual stocking and blocking to processing online order pickups to grabbing cap and gowns to occasionally working the register, I did everything. I'll discuss it more in the story time, but basically, about 2 weeks before moving back in, I applied and got the position. It was easier work for the same pay as working for the grocery store, so that made it especially great. If only I was provided with as many hours as was at the grocery store, but we'll get to that later in the story time. So now let's talk about moving in. So my move-in day was August 17th, 2022. I packed my stuff up and brought it into the living room the night before, so that morning I was ready to pack my truck. Well, not so fast. So I got up at 5:30 that morning, brushed my teeth, got dressed, the usual. Now, I didn't need to arrive at school until 11, but I still had to get up at 6 because I was going out for breakfast with my grandmother, so that's what happened. I drove her up to where we ate breakfast and we both had a delicious meal. I then got back home at around 8 o'clock, which was when I began packing my truck. However, that's when I realized that I wouldn't get everything. Thankfully, my parents and sister were coming up Saturday, so I decided to leave with them some stuff to take up that day. So for the time being, I just got stuff like my clothes, computer, video games, and other necessities. I finished packing up at around 9, which was an hour earlier than I anticipated, so I just hung out in the living room watching YouTube videos with my cat to pass time. But as time slowly progressed, I began to feel really sick. It eventually got to the point where I had to go to the bathroom, and sure enough, I ended up throwing up right into the toilet. Thankfully, the sickness wasn't the type of sickness you get from a bacteria or virus. This is the sickness you get from being nervous and excited, so I was still able to move in on time. But finally, the clock hit 10 o'clock, time to take off, so I said one final goodbye to my cat, locked the living room doors, and drove off. The drive wasn't bad at all, it was just a simple 1-hour drive on the interstate, as my college isn't that far from where I live. Once I got there, I parked my truck in a parking deck and was actually pretty far from where my residence hall was and took my first load with me, which was a laundry basket filled with food as well as my book bag and my back filled with my notebooks and computers. While I would have loved to park closer, the move-in directions for my residence hall stated that we had to park in this particular deck, which sucked since it was pretty far. Anyways, I got to my residence hall's front office, told them my name and my student ID, and then they handed me my key. I then went up to the 4th floor, and after a little bit of searching around, I eventually found my room. So I opened the key and entered my new home for the first time. Now, if you've seen Storytime 46, you already know the story of how I got this housing assignment, as well as what it is. If you're interested, you should watch Storytime 46, as it's actually a pretty intense and interesting story of how I got this housing assignment. But anyways, the housing assignment I had was a 2-person, 2-bedroom suite. So how it worked was that I had a roommate, but we had separate bedrooms and we shared a living room and kitchen. This of course meant that I had my own bedroom, but as we'll see later on, I would have what most college students can only dream of in regards to housing and roommates. Anyways, going back to move-in, let's talk about getting my stuff unloaded from my truck to my room, because holy shit, this was an absolutely agonizing experience. So while my residence hall has a loading dock where you can unload stuff right in front of the building, it was jammed with people unloading, so I had to go back and forth to the parking deck, which was about 500 feet from my residence hall. This ended up taking me a whole 3 hours just to get all my stuff into my room. Oh, and to make things worse, it was 95 degrees outside, so that made it way harder. But once I got everything in my room, I was still not done yet, as now I had to put my stuff in their places and get everything unpacked. But at least this was much easier than unloading everything, as I not only was in an air-conditioned room, but I was also able to take a cold shower before unpacking, which made me feel so much better. However, it wasn't enough to make me completely back to full energy, as I was still completely worn out from moving my stuff in. In fact, I would feel like this for the next 4 days, as it was intense work that I had not been used to, as at the time I did not work out regularly. But eventually, I got everything moved in, and pretty soon, my room looked like home. For the rest of the day, I mostly just laid around and watched YouTube videos, since I was just so exhausted from moving in that I couldn't do much. In fact, I was so exhausted that I ended up going to bed at 8 o'clock that night, but damn did I have a good night's sleep. Well, that was until my alarm went off at 5:30 that morning. You'll see throughout the story time that I began developing many healthy habits such as waking up early, working out, and scheduling, stuff most men my age haven't mastered yet. But my alarm went off and I watched the sunrise from my bed, which was a really nice view. Anyways, I then ate breakfast and spent some more time chilling until it hit 10:30, which meant it was time to get to my first day of work. So I made my way over there, met with my manager, and got to work. So on this day in particular, since it was my first day and because I already had plenty of experience in it, I stocked books. I ended up working until 3 that afternoon, giving me a good 5 hours of work. However, despite being what I was experienced in, this first day was still rather difficult because of how exhausted I was the day before. Fortunately, I would come to find that my managers were really forgiving and really easy to work with, so they helped me carry my books and get them stocked so I wouldn't have to put in as much effort, as well as not hurt my back as much as since it was already in pain. They also did the same thing the next day, but instead of having me work books, they had me bag online orders. So what happened was that I worked in the bagging books. You could say that 5 times faster. Then when a customer came over, we would get their stuff for them. It was a simple task, which I'm glad I had. However, I ended up working for 7 hours that day, the longest I've ever worked before. I didn't complain at all, as I was really happy to get some hours in. In fact, when I finished my shift, I felt incredibly satisfied. So I celebrated like any southerner does by getting cookout, and then I went to sleep since I was tired. That brings us to Saturday, August 20th. So this was the day my parents came up and got the remainder of my stuff. My parents couldn't help me on Wednesday since they both had work, but on Saturday, they were able to get up there and move in my bigger stuff like my gaming chair and TV. Once we got that, we then celebrated by getting some wings at a nearby wing place, and then they took off. Then that brings me to my roommate. So the last day you could move in was that Saturday. However, I hadn't seen him at all throughout Saturday. I knocked on his door a few times, but I got no answer. So on Sunday, I decided that it was time to just open his door. And when I opened his door, my eyes were shot wide open as I realized what had happened to me was what most college students could only dream of. My roommate never moved in. Later on, I would learn that he wouldn't be able to make it at all throughout the semester. This meant that I had an entire bedroom, bathroom, and living room to myself. To say that I was thrilled was an understatement. I was absolutely flabbergasted. I went from having to share a room with a crackhead my first semester to having an entire suite to myself the second. I pretty much won the housing jackpot. This meant that I could do anything I wanted to, from blasting Slipknot, Slayer, or any other metal band I listened to at full volume to screaming at a video game to deep cleaning my room every Saturday. I could do it, and sure enough, I ended up doing all 3 of these things listed, and did some more. I took full advantage of having this massive luxury throughout the semester, because who the hell wouldn't? So yeah, I was set for the semester. I knew I was going to have a blast, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened. I sure as hell did have a blast this semester. Of course, the semester had its challenges, but overall, I was set. Well, now that I've moved into my new home, learned what kind of semester I was about to have, and got everything settled, let's talk about Monday, August 22nd, which was the first day of classes. My first class was at 10:10 that morning, but my day didn't begin at 10:10. Instead, it began at 5:30. My alarm went off at 5:30, so I got up, took a shower, and headed to the cafeteria at around 7. Afterwards, I made my way to the library. So I made it a habit to go to the library every morning, not necessarily to read books, but more to just either study work or work on my own book. In fact, these sessions were where I wrote the majority of my book. Just for reference, at the beginning of the semester, I only had 39 chapters written, putting me roughly a third finished with my book. At the end of the semester, I had 97 chapters written, which placed me only 8 chapters before finishing, which I did end up finishing my book 2 days before 2023. Most of these chapters were written during library times, so yeah, these sessions were crucial regarding progress on my book. And when I wasn't working on my book, I was either studying or getting ahead on schoolwork, so these sessions proved to be very beneficial regarding getting things done. But after hanging out in the library for a couple hours, I packed my stuff up and headed to my first class of the semester. This class was Economics 2101, Principles of Macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is the study of aggregate economics, which is economics on a large scale. So in this class, we talked about things such as gross domestic product, inflation, monetary and fiscal policy, that stuff, just that stuff. So really cool stuff. Now, I had macroeconomics every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10:10 to 11. I also had the same professor for macroeconomics as I did for microeconomics last summer. As stated before, he was an incredibly awesome professor, but now that I had him entirely in person and not meeting online on Zoom, I got to experience the real him, if that's what you want to call it, which was even better than in microeconomics. Anyways, at 11, I got out of his class and went to lunch. After lunch, being around 12:10, I headed back to literally the same classroom, where I had my second and last class of the day, Business Law 3150, which is Business Law 1. Now, I already took Business Law back in early college. I took it during the summer of 2020. In fact, I remember it so well because I've always recalled it as the best class I took at early college, since the content was really interesting and our professor's assignments really engaged me with the material. However, that's community college business law. University business law was different, as it is an upper level business course, hence why it is a 3000 level course, so that's why I had to take it again, but I sure wasn't complaining at all. Anyways, this class met on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 12:20 to 1:10, so it was an afternoon class. At the beginning of each class, we would start with business news, where we were provided the opportunity to share something that is going on in the business world with the class. These were taken as extra credit. I did these almost every class, which gave me 5 points extra credit on my final grade. I also really liked these since they often related to what we were discussing in class, so we got to see the concepts we were learning be applied in the real world. The professor is also really good. She made the class really engaging. She provided a real-world example for almost every concept discussed in class, and she cracked a lot of jokes. The only thing I didn't like about this course is that our 4 exams made up 77% of our grade, meaning just one exam could really screw me up. But thankfully, I ended up making the same grade for 3 of the exams I took, and there was also no final, so that made it a little better. To be honest, this will probably be the class to talk about the least, as nothing really crazy happened this class or anything special, so you won't hear much about this class other than from exams. Anyways, after finishing up with business law that day, I decided to run over to the cafeteria and get another lunch. Afterwards, I went to the bookstore to begin working what would be by far the busiest day of the year. So, being the first class of the day, this is the day that most students get their books, now that they know that if they're required to get them or not. I didn't have to worry about getting books all of mine were online, but damn, there were a lot of people coming by the bookstore in just the 4 hours I worked. So on this particular day, I process online orders. So the bookstore has a program where you can go on its website and order your books from there. It's certainly more convenient than going in and hoping they have your books in stock, but it still has its issues. That's when me and my fellow employees would chime in whenever we got a phone call. Whenever the phone rang, we were required to answer it. Now, I understand what my managers were thinking by implementing this policy, and I'm glad they did because it provided me experience with talking on the phone. But from a business perspective, I do not think that this was a good idea. Having someone like me, who had only been working for 3 days and had never used the online order service, answer questions regarding it was quite the torture. Personally, if I was a manager, I would have opened a customer service position whose job is it to talk to customers in person and on the phone. But I can't really complain about this because once again, it provided me great experience with talking on the phone and helped me become better at talking to people, so it ultimately benefited me in the long run. Anyways, it was busy. Although it was busy and I had to process each individual customer, I was still fully enjoying it, and it seems like the customers really liked me too. As one of my managers said, we were getting a lot of compliments and stuff. So I think that's what I think what I had was going on working. So now that the first day of classes are finished, let's move on to the second day of class. Although technically you could still consider this the first day of class, as I had my first day for my other 2 courses I was taking. My first course of the day was Accounting 3323, which was Intermediate Accounting 1. Now, for most business majors, you usually take Accounting 2122, which is Principles of Accounting 2, after taking Accounting 2121. But for accounting and finance majors, we don't take Accounting 2122, since it's about managerial accounting. In accounting, we take an upper level class about managerial accounting that goes into greater depth, so that's why we don't take it. Anyways, Intermediate Accounting 1 is more like an in-depth Accounting 2121. Just that we don't do completely basic stuff like identifying assets or liabilities or any of that. We do more complicated stuff such as time value of money, debits and credits, construction revenue recognition, and other topics not discussed in Principles 1. So that's that. Anyways, this class met every Tuesday and Thursday from 10 to 11:15 a.m. So it was a little longer than my Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes. My professor was also really cool. She taught part-time as she was also a CPA for a local accounting firm, so she was able to give us some insight into what the accounting world was like, which was really cool. I then had an hour and 45-minute break until my next class, so I just hung out in my room until then. Anyways, after a little while, I got my stuff packed up and headed to my last class of the day, which is also the final class I have to discuss. This class is Statistics 1220, Elements of Statistics, Business Concentration. So this is one of those classes that I've heard all my life people struggle with, but when I took it, I didn't really struggle much with it. Well, until the fourth exam, but we'll discuss that later. Macroeconomics is the same way, but I'll discuss it later as well. Anyways, in statistics, we talked about things such as calculating probability and reading charts to as complicated as two-proportion hypothesis tests to regression analysis. But really, most of the stuff we did could be done on a calculator, so that's what I did, which is why I think I found this class so much easier than most people. Anyways, this class met on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 o'clock or 1 o'clock to 2:15, so it was my latest class. Now, something to note about me is that I tend to not be good at paying attention in the afternoons. I'm better at paying attention in the morning and the evening. That's why the two classes I'll be discussing the most in the story time are macroeconomics and accounting, since I paid attention in those classes the most because they were morning classes. But anyways, the professor for statistics was weird. She kinda reminded me of my old calculus professor, where he would often add steps to make things a little more complicated than what they had to be. She did the same for literally every problem we did, but then she would do the problem again by using the calculator and the problem's specific shortcut. I get she was trying to show us how the formula worked, but come on, ain't nobody gonna use the formula on the exams when the calculator is so much faster. So that made it difficult to pay attention a lot of the time. In fact, on most days, I would just sit there shopping on Amazon, which while it might seem like I slacked off, I would actually go on to make the third highest grade I had ever received in a college course in this class. So that's statistics. Let's talk about clubs. So as mentioned, now that I was 18, I could participate in clubs, so that's what I did. I decided to join this accounting club. Now, I'm not going to discuss the name of this club for privacy reasons, but I'll just say that this accounting club was like a professional club. We would have professionals who worked in the accounting field come and tell us what they do, what their business is like, and more. The club also provided a lot of resources for applying for internships. However, there was a big issue with this club. So in Storytime 46, I've talked a lot about this Bible study I attended every Wednesday night. Well, I wanted to continue participating in it this semester. However, these were held every Wednesday from 7 to 8:30. The accounting club met every Wednesday as well from 6 to 8. I really wanted to hear from accounting professionals, so I decided to go with the accounting club. On top of that, the accounting club had a strict attendance policy where if you missed like 3 meetings, then you got kicked out of the club, so I had to attend them. That's why I decided to not to continue with this club for the spring 2023, as I would like to reconnect with the Bible study since I was already pretty close with everyone when I first joined it back in the spring of 2022. By the way, the Bible study isn't a club, it's an event, which was why I was able to attend it even though I was only 17. But really, not much happened in the accounting club, as I'm not going to discuss it much throughout the story time, but I did want to bring it up because it did take place. So yeah, that was pretty much August. The month was overall not that crazy in terms of schoolwork and stuff, since it's entailed literally the first 2 weeks of the semester. In the past, story times regarding certain school years or semesters had a pretty lengthy segment for the first month, but to be honest, not as much really happened in the fall 2022 semester as the spring 2022 semester, which should explain why this story time isn't nearly as long as the last one. Anyways, let's move on to September 2022. This was a pretty big month for me for a lot of different reasons. It was a big month for me physically, professionally, and socially. I guess I'll go ahead and discuss these three in detail before I talk about classes. So to start with the physical part, this would be the month I began working out. I don't know what made me motivated, but I just decided to run on the treadmill one day, and since then, I've been doing it twice a week. It's helped me a lot since I wasn't doing any exercise before, and while running is all I do, it's really all I need since it gives me exercise and helps me mentally. And it's not too difficult to go to the gym too. Just gotta get my gym clothes on, whip my AirPods and pull up Iron Maiden's Somewhere in Time or Metallica's Ride the Lightning album, and just run for the next 35 minutes. Pretty easy. As for professionally, this brings us to an event I participated in called Meet the Professionals. This annual event, available for any interested accounting or finance major, is a huge 4-day event where a bunch of accounting firms in the area come in and tell us about their company, what kind of things they do, and even opportunities for internships. So this is a big thing that I want to participate in. So I did, and I'm really glad I did because while unfortunately I was unable to get an internship, I learned more about how to apply for one, as well as what kind of things employers are looking at, as I still plan to snag one for the spring 2024 semester, so this still was very helpful. This event, as stated, lasted 4 days. It lasted Wednesday and Thursday in the first week of September from 6 to 9, and then the next Wednesday and Thursday at the same time. All 4 days were very helpful and were great opportunities I took advantage of. That brings me to being better socially as well. So at Meet the Professionals, there was a really cute redhead who just so happened to be interested in me. So she came up and talked to me, and we practically became friends instantly. It also helped that we had a ton in common. For example, she was a gamer, although she was definitely a lot better at video games than I was. She was also a writer, and we were of course both accounting majors. And she also just so happened to be not too far from where I live, so we had that in common as well. And although she was a little older than me, she was 21, but that didn't bother me since I tend to act older than my age anyways. The only red flag I had regarding her was that she was in a sorority. For those who don't know, I have pretty strong opinions about Greek life, as I think that Greek life is an embarrassment to not only my school, but to the entire American public college system. If I was the chancellor at my university, my first order of business would be to dismantle Greek life entirely, as it doesn't do anything but endorse activities that greatly hinder academic success. Like, I'm not even kidding when the vast majority of calls our campus police get come from where the Greek life people live. So that's my take on Greek life. However, with this girl though, I would have never known that she was in a sorority if she didn't tell me, because she was nothing like a normal sorority girl. She was shy, she didn't party, she didn't drink, she went home on the weekends, so the sorority part was nowhere near as bad as it normally would have been. But anyways, this happened on the second day of the event. So the first Thursday, she pretty much followed me the next week and we hung out and stuff. The best part though was that we found out that we had accounting together. So she actually moved seats to sit next to me during class. She had a class afterwards, so I walked her to her class and stuff. So yeah, we had it going. So now that I've talked about those three things, let's talk about the first of many fire alarms this semester. I say many because I can't even count how many fire alarms we had this semester, as there were just so many. Anyways, our first one was technically September 1st, but it happened at 1:30 in the morning. Yeah, with the exception of going off while in the shower, going off while asleep is the worst time for it to go off. Whether it be some dumbass who doesn't know how to cook or some asshole purposely setting it off. It's always annoying going out in the late at night immediately after waking up because for one, I don't want to get up, and two, everything is closed. So even if it's like 30 degrees outside, we still have to stand and wait for the fire department to arrive since everything is closed. It's also just annoying as shit for the fire department too, since they could be using that time to react to real emergencies. So yeah, this happened, and unfortunately, there were many more fire alarms to come. Now let's go back to academics. So we'll start with macroeconomics. So in August, as well as early September, this class was literally just a review of microeconomics, in which we talked about what economics is, supply and demand, and implicit and explicit cost, basically stuff applicable to both fields. So the first exam, which we took on September 9th, it was pretty much just on stuff that I already learned on microeconomics. I didn't do as well as expected on this exam though, as I only made a 90 on it. That sounds good, but since I already knew this material, I didn't do so well as I wanted to, but I was still satisfied with a 90, as an A is an A, so that was that. The next week, I had 2 exams. The first one I want to talk about is our business law exam. So how our professor assigned exams that we would do them online, but we wouldn't go to class for them. We would take them from the comfort of our dorms, apartments, or wherever we lived. However, we had to take them during class time, so between 12:10 to 1:10. So that's what I did. Unfortunately, this exam went just as poorly as my macroeconomics exam. I ended up only making a 78 on the exam, and like macroeconomics, I already knew a lot of the material, albeit it had been 2 years since I had last learned the material, but I still remembered some stuff, so I wasn't too thrilled to make a 78 on this exam. But luckily, I would switch the streak of bad test grades with my accounting exam. So I took this exam on September 17th. I studied some, and then went in and took the exam. But when I went into it, boy was I shocked to see how difficult this exam was. While there was a considerable amount of new material, such as debits and credits, most material we had gone over was a review of Accounting 2121. So to see an exam this difficult stressed me out, but I ultimately got through it, handed it to my professor, it was on paper and pencil by the way, and walked out scared to death. I genuinely had felt like I made a D on it. But later that day, I went in and checked my grade and saw that I had made a 94 on it. Yeah, a 94. I was not expecting that in the slightest. This was a really difficult exam, so to see that I had made a 94 absolutely amazed me. The next class, we reviewed our exam, and I think this is when I learned why I made such a good grade. While I certainly was underestimating my potential in this exam, I don't think that was the main reason. I think the main reason was because my accounting professor was one of the most generous graders I've ever had as a professor. On questions where a majority of the class got incorrect, she would not count them against us and give us bonus points if we got them right. And then in the written section, she would give us points for each individual step we got right. So yeah, she was just so generous of a grader. But even then, I still didn't think I deserved a 94 because of how much I struggled immensely on that exam. So I assumed that I just got lucky on this exam. But as I took more exams for this course, I would discover that this wasn't me getting lucky or just my professor being generous, but rather an issue I had in regards to underestimating myself. Now, let's talk about statistics. But before I get there, I want to talk about how assignments work. So we had two different types of assignments, homeworks and note checks. On homeworks, we were given unlimited time and 3 attempts, and were asked to solve a few problems about certain topics. On note checks, we were given 5 minutes, but the questions came directly from the notes, so we just needed to find the answer in them to answer the questions. Personally, I don't know why note checks even existed, as they didn't serve much of a point, as they weren't worth as much as homework or tests, but they existed. Another issue I had was how random our professor made these assignments do. I have no idea why, but she would choose literally the most random days to make stuff due. Like, it could be any day of the week that something would be due. At least she kept the times consistent, but she could have done a better job of making stuff due on certain days. Surprisingly, I didn't miss a single assignment for statistics, but it was still a hassle trying to get stuff submitted and figure out when it was due. Now, I also want to bring up something my professor did that I think was pretty much determined my grade. So even though this was an in-person class, she didn't require attendance. In fact, I don't think she even knew I existed until the second exam, which I'll explain why when we get there. Like, I had perfect attendance in this class, but I never did much in class other than of course shop on Amazon and sometimes even work on my book. Anyways, because of this, she gave us the remote option, where she would record the lecture and then upload the recording to the Canvas page, where we could either watch it instead of attending, or we could use it as a reference for the homeworks. I refer to this all the time for homeworks for the chapters after the first exam. For material covered on the first exam, I already knew since it was just 6th grade, sixth grade that surprisingly, I was the only one who seemed to know. The material was a review of 6th grade math, and I knew that because of the results of the first exam. So the first exam was on September 22nd, which was on our first 3 chapters. As stated, it was almost entirely a review of our statistics and probability module way back in 6th grade math, with the exception of calculating mean. Since I'm used it a ton when predicting grades throughout middle and high school, I never really used any of that math until this class, but yet I still remember it, so 6th grade was probably the school year I remembered the most material. So since I remembered most of it, this made this test really easy because it was on things like mean, median, mode, range, box and whisker plots, and calculating probability. So when I made a 96 on this exam, I was not anywhere near surprised, but I was still pretty happy about my grade. It was a pretty easy exam overall, and I thought I did pretty well. So I was shocked when I returned the following Tuesday to hear that the class average was only a 77. Even though I know my memory is certainly better than most people's, I still thought that class would do better because of how many rudimentaries this material was. But considering this class had over 200 people, and because I'm really good at math, I think this might explain why I overestimated the average class score. However, before I move on from statistics, I also want to shout my professor out for presenting the overall class averages in a super cool and applicable manner. So being a statistics class, she used concepts we learned in the class to calculate the mean, median, mode, range, and other statistical measures regarding the exam results. She even made a graph showcasing what percentage of people scored a certain amount, and explained under it if it was skewed to left or right, as well as the probability that if someone was chosen at random, they passed the exam. This is probably the coolest thing I have ever seen a professor do, as she used concepts we were learning in class and applied them in order to showcase exam results. That's fucking genius! Now let's move away from academics for a bit and talk a little bit about my RA. So generally a month after move-in, we have individual meetings with our RA, who basically gets to know us, ask questions, and a bunch of other stuff. In the spring of 2022, this was literally the only time I ever saw my RA, since I don't think he ever did much. Like, I didn't remember him at all, but my new RA I had for this semester and the current semester is pretty awesome. You can tell he's really good with talking to people, and is just such a cool guy all around. He also lived diagonally from me, so he saw me a lot and we talked quite a bit this past semester. So yeah, super cool guy. Anyways, I had my meeting with him I think on September 18th, although I'm unsure. But anyways, we talked for a good hour about how college is going, what I'm studying, and basically just become friends. Now that brings me to my very last day of September. So this was a really unique day because this was the day that Hurricane Ian arrived at the Carolinas. Now, Ian was nowhere near as strong here as it was in Florida, but it was still considerably strong. Therefore, because wind speeds were up to like 30 miles per hour, my macroeconomics professor switched to virtual for this day, while my business law professor just canceled class altogether. So I had macroeconomics online, which was actually really cool because I was taking notes while looking out my window and watching it rain hard and stuff. It was cool to see. However, at around noon, that damn fire alarm went off. Yeah, in the middle of a hurricane. I think this was a fire alarm set off on purpose, as I didn't smell any popcorn or anything else. But we all had to go outside and 30-mile-per-hour wind. Well, I did. Instead, I just went to the student union area at the dining hall. I also sat near the window and just watched Mother Nature do her thing for about 30 minutes until I knew I should be able to get back inside my room. But still, this might have been an even worse time for the fire alarm to go off than at midnight or in the shower. So that pretty much wraps up September. September was definitely a month of growth and was overall very productive. So let's move on to October. October 2022 was probably the best month of the year, mainly because of a particular day that I'll discuss and probably the best day of the semester, if not all of 2022. So this day was October 20th, and it involved that redhead. So as mentioned, we had accounting together, and she began sitting beside me. We also began hanging out outside of class together, and as we talked and became closer, I started to have the same feelings for her as she did for me. So October 22nd, right after class, I decided to confess to her. I didn't ask her out. Now, before this, I had been rejected so many times before, mostly because I am rather undesirable and just kinda ugly. So of course nobody has ever said yes, but I got a completely different answer than what I was used to. She said yes and was down for a date. My excitement immediately shot up because it was officially happening. I was going on a date. We then hugged and then I walked her to class. So yeah, that was the day I finally got told yes. I'll discuss the date once we get to November, since that was when it took place. Now, the rest of the day, I was excited as I don't know what. Like, I was literally shaking at statistics, I was screaming in my room, I was stocking books at a record pace at work, I was on top of the world. And that's how I felt for the next 2 weeks. I was extremely happy and was almost at an all-time high. Unfortunately, this didn't last too long, but it was great while it lasted. Anyways, now that that's over with, let's move on from that and talk about academics. So to start, let's talk about my next wave of exams. So I'll start with business law. Our second exam was more of a different types of courts and laws that affect businesses, such as, of course, business court, cyber laws, trade laws, and even criminal laws. So that's what this exam was on. I ended up doing a little better than the previous one by making an 84 on it, which I was pretty happy about. Unfortunately, this would be the highest grade I would make on an exam for this course, but the 78 from earlier was the lowest, so that at least evens out. Now, for macroeconomics, we had another exam, but like the previous exam, I did worse than I thought I would. In fact, I would do far worse. I thought I was going to do pretty well in the exam, as it was on GDP and inflation, both of which were topics I had a good grasp on and understood very well. But unfortunately, I only made an 83 on this exam. Honestly, I have no idea why I did so bad, as I studied quite a bit and knew the material very well, but at least it was a B and not anything lower, but it did drop my grade a considerable amount. It also didn't help that I ended up missing the only assignment I missed all the semester. So in macroeconomics, we had 3 different types of assignments. One was these really long assignments that help you learn the material. Another was a somewhat long assignment that assessed your knowledge of the chapter, and the third was a super short assignment that applied your knowledge to a real world setting. I knew that this assignment was coming up due, and I thought it was a really short one too, so I waited until later. But only for the issues found out was that when I went to do it, it was actually a really long one. So I unfortunately had to take a 0 for it, because I did this like an hour and a half before it was due. But thankfully, my professor was going to do something generous at the end of the semester. And also thankfully, my accounting statistics exam pretty much made up for the bad grades made in macroeconomics and business law. As an example, in accounting, we took our second exam on the 17th. This was an even harder exam than the first one. Like, maybe with the exception of a couple algebra tests back from 8th grade, as well as maybe the Intro to Computers final from 9th grade, this was the hardest exam I had ever taken up to this point. I say it up to this point because, believe it or not, I would take an even harder exam at the end of the semester. I don't think it'll surprise anyone if I said what it was, so I'll just go ahead and say that it was the final for this course. Anyways, back to this second exam, I studied my ass off on this content. We were being tested on balance sheets and income statements. It didn't seem like that difficult since balance sheets were just assets equal to liabilities plus stockholders' equity, while income statements were just revenues minus expenses. But trust me, there was a whole bunch of material in these that made these exams incredibly difficult. And because of that, and from not understanding the material the night before, I became incredibly frustrated. No, I'm sorry. So I ultimately just went to bed completely frustrated. But thankfully, I felt much better about myself about the test as a whole that morning. So I studied some, this time with a better attitude, and was able to understand the material much better. Then came time for the exam. Of course, being a difficult exam, I struggled immensely, so when I handed my exam to my professor, I was not feeling very confident. Well, later that day, I would discover what grade I made, and just like the last exam, I did so much better than I thought I did. I ended up making a 92 on this exam. Yeah, I was not expecting to make another A. I thought it was pure luck that I made an A than the one before, but I guess it really wasn't luck or even my professor's generous grading, but more my underestimation of myself. I have a tendency to think I'm a whole lot worse than I really am. As a result, I often ace exams since I think I'm going to fail. I've always struggled with this, and I struggle with it today, but this course definitely exposed me to this issue. Anyways, let's move on to statistics. So we had our exam on the 27th, and let's just say this was probably the best exam I took the entire semester, mainly because of what I made. Now, something to note is that up to this point, we were no longer going over 6th grade math and statistics anymore. We were now doing all the big boy stuff like binomial distributions, discrete random variables, and a whole bunch of other complicated statistics stuff. So I actually had to shop on Amazon because fuck this class. Not for real. Everything discussed for this exam could be done on the calculator, so simply relied on a calculator for it. Additionally, our professor provided the study guide for the exam, which I used to study. As this was also a good idea because the study guide was almost identical to the exam. Just that it was entirely written response instead of a couple multiple choice like the exam was, and there were a few different numbers. Anyways, while I technically did underestimate what I was going to make, I still expected an A on this test, as I understood the material really well, so I wasn't that nervous about it. But that changed a little bit when the guy beside me made a 76 on this exam. I knew this because before we left, we have to show our professor our grade to prove that we submitted the exam. So he showed, and I of course saw it, and since I sat beside him, so that made me a little nervous. But I didn't know it was nervousness that made me smarter or what, because when I submitted the exam, I ended up making a 100 on it. Yeah, a 100. I was shocked because there was one question I was rather unsure about, but it seems like it worked out in my favor. So when I showed my professor what I made, that sure made me feel like a badass since the people to the left of me and behind me could see my computer, and they all saw that shining 3-digit grade. In the next class, they actually congratulated me for making 100 on the exam, which made me feel like even more of a god at statistics. Anyways, let's talk about the next class. So our professor again had the class average and other statistical measures for the exam and showed them to us. Seems like the class didn't do as well, as the class average was only a 63. Yeah, that's quite low, but I can't really say too much because this was completely new material. But anyways, while talking, our professor mentioned a minimum and maximum. The minimum was only a 16, which to whoever made that, hope you're having fun taking statistics again. And then she moved on to the maximum, which was held by me with the 100. Legit, when she was talking about the maximum, I genuinely wanted to laugh so badly. I don't know why, but I just thought it was funny hearing my grade be talked about in front of 200 people. But I kept calm and didn't cause a disruption. But I actually didn't keep a 100 on this exam. You see, she gave us extra credit questions throughout the class for an opportunity to add bonus points to our exam. I did these, and as a result, my grade ended up being increased to a 110. So I guess that's just more of a flex. Unfortunately, I would no longer hold the title of being a statistics god after the next exam, but I still would make a high grade on my next exam. So that's how academics went. Let's move on to work. So October was a really good month for me overall, but it was not a good month for me regarding work. So being the middle of the semester, this was kind of like our off season. Therefore, we didn't have many customers and therefore not as much work. So my hours were reduced from 15 back when we were doing strong to just 3 hours a week throughout October. Yeah, 3 hours. Well, that sounds convenient. It meant that I was losing out on a lot of money to make. 3 hours a week wasn't enough to pay for groceries each week. So therefore, I was having to use money saved up from working a lot back at the beginning of the semester to pay for them. So that was a big issue. I attempted to resolve this by asking my manager for more hours, but she wouldn't oblige, so I was stuck working 3 hours a week. But conveniently enough, around the middle of the month, I got an email from my college's tutoring department that said, "Hey Zach, congratulations on making an A in Math 1120 back in the spring 2022 semester. Would you like to come tutor this class next semester?" This caught my eye because, well, it wasn't me applying for a job, but rather a job applying to me. I then looked at the job benefits, which included the guaranteed 5 hour, guaranteed at least 5 hours a week, 25% higher salary than at the bookstore, and I was doing something within my field of study. So I said hell yes and applied. I applied to be a tutor for Math 1120, which is Business Calculus, and Accounting 2121 because I love that class a ton. Now, when filling out the application, I had to get recommendations from my professors I had the classes before, which I emailed both of them and explained what was going on. Both of them were more than eager to recommend me since I did so well in those classes. Then a week later, I got scheduled for an interview on November 1st. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to November 22nd, or November 2022. This month started out great, but it really went down the drain once we get to Thanksgiving. I'll explain more about that later, but first, let's talk about the interview, since that happened on the first day of the month. Now, before the interview, I had already begun providing the questions, so that made it a whole lot easier. But even if I didn't have the questions, I still would have done great because these were actually really easy questions. But even better than that, me and the employer hit it off really well. The first question she asked was what I like to do in my free time. I explained that I like to work out, read, write, and drive. The driving was when she was really interested, as she had a passion for driving like I did. And considering I literally do driving videos, y'all know I love driving. So we talked about where we had all been and crazy things we'd seen people do on the road and stuff. And then for the other questions, I answered really well too. I didn't ask good questions as well, so needless to say, I had probably my best interview ever. And it paid off because the next week, I got an email that saying I was hired. So yeah, I officially secured a new job for the spring 2023 semester. I'm now working here, and I absolutely love it. So yeah, that's how I got a job with the tutoring department, or should I say how the tutoring job got an employee with me. On top of big things happening in November, let's talk about probably the biggest thing that happened this month, being my very first date with the redhead. So a week prior, I learned that her parents were rather restrictive. They wanted to take her to our date rather than me drive her, which I thought was kind of strange because she was 21 and in college. But I mean, I didn't mind. All that mattered was I was going on a date with her, so that didn't bother me. But it was still kind of a red flag. Anyways, this date occurred on November 4th. We went to a local corn maze and hung out for a couple hours. I got off work at around 6:30 and drove over there. We then met up and made our way through the maze. The whole time we were talking, joking around, just having a good time. When we got out of the maze, we played some farm games as well as visited the petting zoo. We continued to talk and just had fun. To be honest, it felt more like we were hanging out rather than dating, since we were generally just acting like friends. But then, we were walking around for a little bit and then talked. And that's when we did another thing that I had never done before. Hold hands. We held hands for a little while and then our parents arrived. So I walked her over to her car and yeah, that was the night. It was an amazing night because for one, I held hands with a redhead, and two, I officially got to say that I'd been on a date. But unfortunately, things wouldn't go well in the future, which I'll get to that at the end of the month. So yeah, that's my first and so far only date I've been on. It went really well and I think I'll remember that night for the rest of my life. It was her first date too, so it was a really good memory that we'll both share for the rest of our lives. Anyways, let's move on and discuss academics. So to start off, I took my third business law exam. This is probably the most difficult exam in the course, as contracts can be kind of difficult, especially when trying to remember when they have to be in writing and when they don't. There's a shit ton of exceptions and stuff regarding them too, which is what makes contracts pretty confusing. So when I made a 78 on this exam, I really wasn't all that shocked, but it was better to make it something lower, so I was fine with it. Now the next exam I had was for macroeconomics, which was interestingly the same as the date. So this is a really stressful night before in the morning. But anyways, this exam was on things like unemployment, finance on a macroeconomic scale, and GDP per capita. I wasn't nearly as comfortable on those as it was with GDP and inflation, so that scared me a lot. But just like I suppose my nervousness did in statistics, my nervousness in macroeconomics got me a better grade in the form of a 92. I was expecting a low B on this exam, so I was very happy to see that made an A, meaning I had finally redeemed myself and meaning I was back on track in macroeconomics. That brings me a couple weeks later to the third accounting exam. So other than the Western History midterm I took the spring 2022 semester, this was the weirdest exam I've ever taken in college. The reason this exam was weird was because for the most of the material, I was really confident about. This included time value of money, which I found really easy because not only could I do it on a calculator, but it was also super applicable to the real world in regards to savings account, as we talked a lot about compound interest and annuities. We also talked about revenue recognition, which is basically about when a company recognizes revenue. Basically, companies don't always recognize revenue when they first receive it. They only recognize it when they earn it. So either when the customer receives the goods or when the company produces the service. These are rather easy concepts that I didn't struggle with much. However, there's one thing that stressed me out a ton about this exam, and that was construction problems. So construction companies recognize revenue a little differently than other companies. They recognize revenue as a proportion of how much of a project they have completed. So if they're paid $5 million to build a bridge and only finish 20% the first year, they'll recognize $1 million at the end of the year, and the rest of the money is recognized as deferred revenue. I know this is probably above most of what y'all, since I know not everyone watching this is an accountant or a finance nerd, but that's about as simple as I could put it. And by the way, my example above was a super simple one. Normally these problems get incredibly complicated with a whole lot of numbers and variables and stuff that just throws you off. So that's why I was stressed out. I also knew that these were going to be written response questions too, so I was super terrified. But I went in there, did my best, and interestingly, this is the best I felt about an accounting exam. The multiple choice section was super easy, since it mostly consists of time value of money problems and simple revenue recognition problems, but the written response questions, which in fact include 2 construction problems, will really almost made me have a panic attack. I sincerely hope that in the future when I am auditing financial reports, I do not have an audit construction company, because my god is revenue recognition for them so complicated. Anyways, I was still pretty confident overall about the exam, so I handed it to my instructor and de-stressed myself by doing a driving video. When I got back from my driving video, I went and checked what grade I made for the exam, and sure enough, I did it again. I made another A, this time a 93. At this point, I fully knew that I understood the material so much better than I thought it did, because I should not be making A's when I felt so unconfident about the material. But it's not even the biggest slap in the face for me. The biggest one was that I got both of the construction problems absolutely correct. Yeah, I got the 2 problems I stressed the hell out of absolutely right. At this point, I don't know if I'm an accounting god or if my professor just felt really bad for me, but I'll take either one. Preferably the first one, since I won't have to have her for the CPA, or since I won't have to have her for, I don't know what the hell I was writing. Preferably the first one, since, okay. At this point, I don't know if I'm an accounting god or if my professor just felt really bad for me, but I'll take either one. Preferably the first one, since I won't have her for the CPA exam. But nonetheless, I was absolutely flabbergasted and relieved I did well. That brings us to statistics, but unfortunately, I did not do as well as I did on the second exam, but I still did really well. What was weird about that was that even though I found this material easier than what was on the previous exam, but I just didn't do as well. Anyways, this exam was on a sample hypothesis test. It sounds complicated, but it's actually really simple since you could do it on the calculator. So that's what I did, and I made a 92. Not bad, but a little lower than I wanted to. Thankfully, that got changed to a 94, so that looked a little better, but it also did mean that my grade was no longer 100 in statistics like it was before, so it was still a 98, so that was pretty high. Anyways, let's get to the rather unfortunate part of the semester. So up to this point, the semester had been absolutely phenomenal, but late November was when things went to shit. My mood went from being really good to being at a really low point, and unfortunately, this continued for the remainder of 2022, but it has so far had an interesting turn of events in 2023. Let's talk about statistics again. So after that exam, we discussed 2 sample hypothesis tests. This was by far the most challenging topic in the course because we couldn't use the calculator, as some dumbass at Texas Instruments programmed the thing wrong, so we had to do it manually, and my god was this a super long formula. My professor also added a lot of unnecessary steps when using this formula, further confusing me, so when I found out she assigned us 2 homeworks on this material the same day she taught it to us, due that night before, the day before Thanksgiving, I was angry as shit. It took me a whole 3 hours to do the homework assignments, and I didn't even get good grades on them, dropping my overall grade to a 95. I was mad as hell. I was also upset because it meant I had to go home late for Thanksgiving, so that was overall just a huge dick move on my professor's part. Now, that wasn't the only thing that had me upset during this time. I was also incredibly angry about my AirPods. So my right AirPod basically stopped charging, so when I put my AirPods in my left ear, I would only get music from my left one. This was incredibly upsetting because that meant that I couldn't work out since working out without AirPods would have been incredibly boring and awkward. And I also have to walk around campus and listen to music, making that super boring as well. I tried everything, but it eventually led to me ultimately having to contact Apple support. Thankfully, they were very cooperative and worked on my AirPods for free, since I had a warranty. I'll explain what happened when I get to December, as I had something even better than just getting them fixed. But the main thing that was really frustrating me was the girl. She was taking longer to answer texts and was also declining like everything I invited her to. Now, I'm not trying to shame her for this, as I completely understand it, she had her own life too, but it was still awkward being declined to hang out after hanging out with her all the time and even going on a date. So I began getting worried and concerned, which took a huge toll on my mental health throughout late November. I began to think that she was not interested in me or that I had hurt her somehow, and as a result, my mood pretty much was completely determined by her. If I got a message from her, I'd be in a good mood. If I had gone a day without a response, I was in a sour mood. That ultimately made Thanksgiving this year really suck. It was hard to really enjoy family time and really anything else I enjoyed because all I could think about was her. It also made me super angry knowing I was the only single person at Thanksgiving. In fact, just seeing any happy couple made me filled with rage knowing I was unable to get into a relationship. Like, when I saw couples on campus holding hands, kissing, or hugging, all I could think about was beating the ever-living shit out of them. It just felt like it wasn't fair for everyone else to be with someone and then me by myself. Now, just to clarify, I speak of this in past tense because it doesn't seem to affect me too much anymore. I've been doing a lot better in regards to being around couples and not feeling as angry. I've also been a lot more active and I guess more out there so far in 2023, which I can already tell has benefited me, so I am doing better, but I'm still kind of in that pain phase where it's like, why do I have to be that loser who's single? And that brings me to December 2022, which was probably the worst month of the year. And December 1st, 2022 was probably the worst day of the year. So on December 1st, I decided to try and maybe ask her out on a date after exams, but unfortunately, I ended up getting a no. I didn't really feel too surprised after the signs I had been getting, but it was still painful. All the excitement and steps I took earlier to this semester had all gone to waste. I truly felt like the worst of the worst. I also was just incredibly embarrassed, because now it was just going to be awkward to talk to her. So yeah, I hated myself immensely during this time. But one weird thing to note is that when she did reject me is that while I felt incredibly bad about myself and all, I had a strange feeling that a giant weight being lifted off my shoulders. Like I felt like I was free or something. Looking back on it, I think this is the way of having my mood being determined by her. I relied on her for my entire mood, so no longer having to rely on her made me feel more free, and now, while I am still kind of sad about being rejected, I've pretty much moved on, and now focus more on my book. Right before 2023 began, I finished my book, which is what I think has shifted my mind immensely, because now I'm more focused on editing it and getting it published over worrying about a girl. So that's why I'm doing much better just a month later, while I'm still don't really have much hope for finding anyone anymore. I have hope in other things. So that's that. And normally students dealing with stuff like this tend to do worse in their classes. But I'm the opposite. During difficult times, I tend to get higher grades. When I was suicidal back in 8th grade, I actually had the highest grade in science until of course got my classes switched after attempting suicide. And in 11th grade, which was during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, I made some of the highest grades I had ever made since 6th grade. And speaking of 6th grade, I was struggling with adapting and being transferred to a school in a different school district. I managed to read more books that school year than I have during all other school years combined. This unique principle applied the same way during this time, as academically, with the exception of December 2021, which was the month I graduated from early college, December 2022 was the best month for me academically. So let's talk about a change in tone for it. So to start, let's talk about my last exam for statistics, which we had on the last day of class. Now you might think that I'm being hypocritical discussing this story after discussing academic excellence during difficult times, but we'll get there. I promise. Anyways, I did not do well on this exam. I made a 76 on it. What in the hell happened here? Well, as stated, my professor pulled a dick move by making new material, due like the day before Thanksgiving, which would just so happen to be the hardest concept in the entire class, due the night before she taught it, the day before Thanksgiving break. Like, what the hell? So that had a large negative impact on my grade. I also was in an incredibly bad mood as well, so that made it harder to study. As a result, I predicted that I would make around a 40, but like with someone accounting, I have an issue with underestimating myself. But that's not all. Our professor promised that if we made a good grade on our final, then she'll replace our lowest exam score with the grade we make on the final. So I had the opportunity to do better on the final so I could get my grade bumped up. Now let's move on and discuss how I made better grades during bad times by moving on to Friday, December 9th. So that night, I took my final for statistics. I spent a ton of time studying, refreshing my memory, and trying to learn 2 sample hypothesis tests. I took a few practice tests, and the highest grade I made on one was a 74. I needed at least an 81 to make an A, so I was not looking too sharp. However, I didn't know if my brain had a boost of energy or what, but I was able to breeze through the final. There were a couple questions that tripped me up, but I was still able to answer them upon coming back to them. I think a lot of this had to do with the final being similar to the practice ones I took, which were all tests for previous semesters, so I think that explains why I breezed through. But let me tell y'all, when I finished looking over my answers and handed my test to my professor and walked out of the room, that was one of the greatest feelings ever. Statistics was a super frustrating class, so being finished with it felt amazing. Like, immediately when I got back to my room, I took all of my statistics material and threw all that shit down the trash chute in my residence hall. And the best part is that I ended up making a 95 on this final. I was expecting between a high C to a low B, so this 95 made me all the more happy. This 95 was also applied to my 4th exam, meaning I had a 95 instead of a 76 for it. Oh, and if you think my statistics professor is done, wait to hear what she did as a super nice surprise. So after recording our final exam grades, she dropped our 3 lowest homework grades. That meant those 2 homework assignments before Thanksgiving got dropped, and another one that I think I made an 80 on. She didn't say in the syllabus that she would do this, so this was a super nice surprise. As a result, my final grade in statistics came out as a whopping 97, which gave me an A as well as the highest grade in the entire class of over 200 students. That felt amazing. So, once I finished my statistics exam, I still had about 5 days to study for the rest of my exams, as I had both my macroeconomics and business law exams on Wednesday, December 12th, and my accounting final the next day. So that's what I did. Wednesday, December 14th. I don't know why I put 12th. I decided to take a break from studying that weekend, since I definitely deserved a break after finishing up my most frustrating and most at-stake class at the moment. But once Monday hit, it was time to get back to work. Anyways, let's jump to Wednesday and talk about macroeconomics exam. So this was by far the easy exam I took this semester. The final for this class wasn't cumulative, it was just on the last 3 chapters, which were about aggregate supply and demand, fiscal policy, and monetary policy respectively. I had a huge understanding of each chapter by the time the exam rolled around. Aggregate supply and demand was somewhat of a review of microeconomics, but with macroeconomic concepts, and then monetary and fiscal policy were so easy because I could connect it to the current economic environment. So that made these exams much easier, and it showed. I'm at a 93 on this exam, giving me a 92 as my final grade in macroeconomics. Now, before I move on, I will discuss my opinion on a pretty heated topic regarding micro and macroeconomics. So business majors can't seem to agree which one is easier or harder. Some say microeconomics is easier because it's more applicable to the business field, while some say that macroeconomics is easier because it's more broad and also talked a lot about in the media. From my experience, I found macroeconomics much easier than microeconomics. Now, I do have some bias here because not only did I find macroeconomics more interesting, but I also took it as a normal style of class while I took microeconomics over the summer. But taking those aside, I think macroeconomics is easier because it's a lot more conceptual than in microeconomics. In microeconomics, I found myself using graphs so much more often than in macroeconomics. Macroeconomics was just more conceptual and more understanding, while microeconomics is more of an application-based field and requires a little more math. Me and my dad get into this discussion a lot, since he's on the side that thinks microeconomics is easier, but nonetheless, I still think that if you're planning to go into business, you should definitely take microeconomics first, and then macroeconomics, because it will make macroeconomics so much easier and make more sense, as well as of course giving you a more business-related course before taking more of a government-related course. So now let's move on and talk about business law. So just like other exams, this exam was not taken in class, but we had to take it between 11 and 1:30. Which was the time provided by the university to take it, but since it was also not cumulative, as it only covered the last 3 chapters, we were still only provided 50 minutes to take it. So I did it, submitted it, and would you look at that, another 78. I was honestly expecting much higher because this exam was on employment law, which I find super interesting. Like, if I was to go to law school, I would definitely study employment law because I find it really interesting. But anyways, I unfortunately had to take a B in business law, as I only came out with an 87, which that's not bad at all. I think if I had studied a little more, I probably could have made an A in the class. I also wasn't upset that I made a B in the class, since I knew an A was impossible to get since the second exam, so I was happy to have fortified a B. That brings me to the last final for the semester, being accounting. So like the statistics final, this final was cumulative, so it covered material from all chapters, which was actually good because it covered basic things like debits and credits, financial ratios, and time value of money, but at the same time, more complex stuff was on the exam too, with the exception of construction problems, as my professor thankfully did not put one on the exam, since they had kind of become a meme throughout the class for being so difficult. Anyways, I ended up having a similar experience studying for this exam as I did for the second exam. I began to get extremely frustrated because I didn't remember or understand the material. But that was when, eventually while studying, I just completely shut everything down. I knew that if I continued studying, I'd only grow more restless and would grow more angry, resulting in me doing worse. I also calmed myself down by trying to tell myself that even if I didn't take this exam, I could still make a C. To make a B, I had to make an 18, and to make an A, I had to make a 67. These surprisingly helped, as I was able to calm myself down and go to sleep. I then got up really early, as this was an 8 a.m. exam, so I got in my room around 7:45, waited a few minutes, and eventually got the exam started. Now, this final was by far the hardest test I've ever taken. In fact, it was harder than every algebra test I took in 8th grade, as well as my Intro to Computers final exam combined. This exam was absolutely ridiculous, but this was actually a good thing because it prepared me for what the CPA exam would be like when I take it in 2024. But the exam itself was hard as shit. But interestingly, the written response questions were much easier than the multiple choice sections. No idea how that happened, but they were. Anyways, I worked on this test for about 2 hours until I finished. So once I finished, I handed it to my professor and breathed one huge sigh of relief, knowing that this semester was over with. I then walked to my room, took a 3-hour nap, and got to cleaning my room up before preparing to move out for Christmas break. Then the next day, my grades came in. I was expecting around a 30, as this was a stupidly difficult exam, but to my complete shock, I made an 85 on it. Not as high as my other exams, but considering that this was the hardest exam I had ever taken, I count that as 120 in my book. I completely blew it out of the water. This gave me a 94 in accounting, giving me an A for this class. And once my grade for accounting was placed, that allowed me to do what made December 2022 a super important month for my academic career: declare my major. So I think it should be obvious that I declared a major in accounting. After all, I had already taken accounting 3323, finished, and I loved it, so I was ready to go into accounting profession. But as mentioned, accounting would not be the only thing I did. I ultimately declared both a double major and a minor, with a double major being in accounting and finance with a minor in economics. I find the finance part in accounting to be super interesting and even more interesting than the accounting portions, so that's why I decided to do a double major, and also because it's literally only 3 more classes. I am also minoring in economics because I absolutely love economics, and because I unfortunately can't do a triple major since that would take extra 2 semesters. But by the time I graduate in college, I'll have 150 credit hours, making me eligible to sit for the CPA exam immediately after college, and allowing me to be a CPA before the age of 21. So yeah, that's economics for this semester. That Saturday, Dad came over and helped me move my stuff up, and once my stuff was out, that concluded the fall 2022 semester. So yeah, that was my second semester of college. I know that compared to my first semester, this was extremely tame and overall uneventful semester, but there was still a considerable amount that happening, like my first day, declaring my major, and being completely on my own. So what is in store for spring 2023? Well, let's talk about classes I'm taking this semester. So I'm taking Management Information Systems 3130, which is Management Information Systems, Finance 3120, which is Financial Management, Operations and Supply Chain Management 3100, which is Operations Management, Accounting 3300, which is Professional Development for Accounting Majors, Accounting 3324, which is Intermediate Accounting 2, and Economics 3125, which is Managerial Economics. That totals out to 16 credit hours, so I got quite a workload. However, the main benefit from these courses is that for Intermediate Accounting 2, I get the same professor I had for Intermediate 1, meaning it's just simply a continuation of Intermediate 1 with the same stuff. And for Managerial Economics, I get the same professor I had for both Micro and Macroeconomics, which I am super excited to have him for a 3rd class. So yeah, I have a wild busy schedule this semester, I still got good classes. I also have the new tutoring job. It's not too busy right now since classes have just started, but pretty soon I'll be helping people taking those lower level business classes, which I'm really excited about, and I'm happy to get some experience talking to people, something I definitely need to improve on. So yeah, that's all I got for this story time. Thank you all so much for watching this story time, and I'll catch you all on Storytime 48, which I plan to release after I've published my book about the